To begin, we would like to acknowledge where tonight's event is taking place. TIFF is stationed on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are very grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community. And as a film-based organization operating on this land, it's both our great honor and our duty to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities by showing the works of Indigenous filmmakers here at TIFF. Next Friday, June 21st, we're hosting a screening of short films created by Indigenous filmmakers and produced by Wabakoni Mobile, an initiative that supports audiovisual production in Indigenous communities, not just here on Turtle Island, but across the world. So tonight's event is part of the series Godard in the 60s, Breathless to Weekend, on now until July 16th. During the series, we'll be presenting archival prints courtesy of the TIFF Film Reference Library Screening Collection, including Breathless, Made in the USA, Weekend, and two or three Things I Know About Her. For complete screening dates and times, you can visit our website, tiff.net, or you can stop by the box office downstairs and talk to the lovely folks there. And more good news for the Francophiles in the house. TIFF Cinematheque is hosting Summer in France all summer long with 4 highly selective retrospectives in addition to the Godard series, including our first ever retrospective of Jacques Becker, a memorial tribute series for Jeanne Moreau, and spotlights on the films of Jean Renoir and Alain Resnais. And again, you can head to tiff.net for more information about those. And all summer, you can experience TIFF Cinematheque screenings accompanied by extended introductions by special guests just like this one, featuring speakers from the film community and beyond. So our next up, on July 19th, we have choreographer and performer Christopher House speaking on Alain Resnais's Last Year at Marienbad, and Mr. House will reflect on the influences of film on his work as a dancer and choreographer, with a particular focus on the ambiguous narratives of the 2016 performance work Marienbad, which he created with his which he co-created with artist Jordan Tannehill, who's also Toronto-based. So come on back for that. And now it's time for me to introduce our special guest. Anna Fitzpatrick is a Toronto-based culture writer and children's book author. She's contributed to the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and Hazlitt, and she works as the digital media editor for The Believer. She previously worked as a books columnist at the National Post and as the online editor for War and Fashion Journal. Please join me in welcoming Anna Fitzpatrick.
Thank you so much for coming out here, and thank you for TIFF and to Lydia and Jessica and Caitlin for inviting me, and for all of you coming out, squeezing this in before Game 6, which apparently is happening right after in here. To watch Femme EST UNE. This is actually the first of Godard's movies that I had seen. It was my introduction to his work when I was in high school at the time. Just a disclaimer, I'm going to talk about myself for like 2 minutes and then it's all going to be about him. So if you have to go to the bathroom. Anyway, when I was in high school, I was, a quiet, bookish kid. The sort of like unpopular kid that like the unpopular kids don't think are cool, but I really wanted to be cool. So I had this journal, semi-private diary on a social networking site called livejournal.com. Anyone? Yeah? Okay, awesome. And the way that website worked is you could join communities and groups based on shared interests. So I searched for a group. I think the tags I looked up were art and literature and Nylon magazine. And I joined a group called, this is true, Black Cigarette. You can Google it, but don't. So there's a description of the group that still exists on urbandictionary.com, which I pulled up last week, but this is written 12 years ago. Black Cigarette, a very pretentious community on LiveJournal. They try to be as indie as possible in various ways. They will listen to music you have never heard of, watch movies you have never seen, and dress unique. They also all seem to be obsessed with France/Paris. So obviously I thought everyone in this group was super cool. And one of them had made a post in the community about how Godard was the best director ever. And I had never heard of him, but if there's one thing that I was like really good at doing when I was a teenager, it was homework. So I went to the Ottawa Public Library where I was able to find a copy, I think on VHS, of Femme EST UNE FEMME, A Woman is a Woman. And also a quick segue to say that growing up in Ottawa, I was forced to take French immersion by my parents, and I hated French. I went to a school where if you were caught speaking English anywhere, the teachers would make you sit down and conjugate verbs. But then, I would watch these movies where French is like this, like cool, stylish, sexy thing. So it was just a very different experience. And Femme was like no movie I'd seen before, at least not any old movie, which I had associated with my grandparents, like long and boring and black and white. But this movie, it has a sense of humor about itself. It plays with form a lot, like the sound will cut in and out. Characters will acknowledge that they're in a movie, talk about being in Hollywood musicals. They break the fourth wall, they talk to the camera. You have the woman at the center, Angela, played by Godard's collaborator, muse and wife, the Danish actress Anna Karina. And she looks like a doll, but she has like this swagger in this movie that's just, she's just really cool. And I didn't really understand the movie, but I knew it was my favorite movie of all time at that point. I was, in every respect, a poser. So over the next few years, I watched whatever Godard movies I could, usually from the library. I focused on his output from the 60s, the New Wave years, up until 1968. Because even then I could understand that was the visually coolest era. And, as a poser, visuals are really important. So I didn't necessarily understand all the political context, but I was attracted to these cool women he put on screen. And, I want to dress like them and mimic their affect and their style. Kind of still do. I cut my hair like Chantal Goya this week. That was my reference. But actually, as I rewatched these movies as an adult, I realized that in many ways I kind of had the perfect introduction to him, because I think, and I still think this, that Godard's movies, they're kind of made for teen girls living in the suburbs who are really, really trying to be cool. Because I think Godard and a lot of his characters are also posers. It's thank you. It's easy to think of Godard as his political director, because his movies, especially to the mid to late 60s, they're filled with characters who talk about Mao and Marxism and these anti-consumerist ideals, but he kind of has this superficial approach to politics, which you dig into his biography, you learn more about. It's known that Godard was started as a film critic at Cahiers du Cinéma in Paris. He belonged to this collective of film lovers, François Truffaut, Eric Rohmer, a lot of future filmmakers who would end up making the French New Wave. And what a lot of people don't realize is they were actually super right-wing, not because they had conservative politics. Eric Rohmer was like raised Catholic, so he did, but the rest just kind of copied him. But it was because, and I'm quoting Richard Brody from his biography, Everything is Cinema, which his biography on Godard says, since the main French adversaries of the American cinema were the Communist Party, and since the unions made it difficult for young people to enter the film business, the young cinephiles who adored American movies were necessarily anti-communist. So essentially their whole political philosophy came down to movies are good, and the commies are trying to stop the movies. So when Godard started making short films, they were about gender dynamics and the relationships between men and women. Oh, except he made one early short documentary about a dam, but I don't really count that. So he has in one movie, All the Boys Are Named Patrick. It's about two female roommates who, unbeknownst to each other, are dating the same man. And he ends up blowing them off for a third woman at the end. His next short film, Charlotte and Her Boyfriend, is 13 minutes long. Almost the whole thing is a monologue in which a character played by Jean-Paul Belmondo, he goes on this tirade against his girlfriend, angrily berating her, talking about why he's better than her, begging her to never leave him, only for the film to end with her delivering one line, which is her leaving him for another man. Godard actually had to dub over Belmondo's speech in post-production with his own voice. Belmondo was unable to do this himself because he was serving in the Algerian War, which Godard, meanwhile, was able to skip out on the draft by claiming his Swiss citizenship because he wanted to stay behind and make movies, which, again, kind of sums up his politics. And then he started making full-length films, most famously Breathless, which you can all see tomorrow, which it's a relatively apolitical movie, but critics took this to be a political statement. The main character, Michel Picard, played again by Belmondo, a lot of left-wing critics interpreted him as a fascist. They called him a cop lover, even though he kills a cop, so it's a bit of a stretch. But there's this one really hyperbolic review. The critic, Louis Seguin, says, He says about Picard that he seems like, and I quote, one of those guys who writes death to Jews on the walls of the Met Show and then spells it wrong. Godard described Breathless as being about a boy who thinks about death and a girl who doesn't, which has always been like a really interesting analysis to me, just because the movie, it opens up with Michel Picard hotwiring a car, ditching a woman, shooting and killing a police officer, hightailing it to Paris, and then stealing from another woman that he's been sleeping with. And then you meet Patricia, played by Jean Seberg, and she's just trying to sell some newspapers. She famously expresses in the movie that she feels both unhappy and unfree, but the only crimes she really commits are, which she does commit crimes, is to help the man she loves escape from the police until eventually she doesn't. So Godard's movies will feature a fair number of female rule breakers, but this movie sets up a dynamic we'll see repeatedly in which you have men who feel trapped by the limits of society and then women who feel trapped by the limits of men. So Godard's follow-up, Le Petit Soldat, The Little Soldier, deals with the French Algerian War head-on. But again, the focus is on a romantic relationship. And incidentally, so in May of 1958, when the French military attempted a coup in Algeria, Godard was at the Cannes Film Festival, totally oblivious to the news, and then decided he was going to make a movie about Algeria. And he wanted it to be even-handed. So he doesn't take a side. He shows torture on both sides of the political aisle. You get Michel Seberg's character. He's tortured by the Algerian revolutionaries. And then Anna Karina's character is tortured and killed off-screen by the French. And Godard was trying to avoid the French censors and by pretending that there was nothing political about this movie. So in interviews, he said it's just a Western with kidnappings and stuff like that, which did not work. The movie was banned by the French government. And in a movement, actually, it was led in part by a National Assembly representative, a super right-winger named Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's Marie Le Pen's father. And then he made UNE FEMME. It's relatively lighthearted in that nobody gets waterboarded. Spoiler alert. I'll come back to it in a second, but so it's around this time that 1961, Godard starts giving interviews where he identifies more with the left, but like mostly on an aesthetic level. So he kind of realized that the politics of the 50s are fading out and that there was this cool new movement coming up where like the leftists were making the more interesting art. So he decided to align himself with them, while meanwhile the right-wingers were censoring his art. But again, he explored his politics through his aesthetics, and his aesthetics so often came down to his women. So even as his movies became increasingly more anti-capitalist, exploring this left-wing concept, they still kind of focused on how these views played out in the dynamics between men and women. You can see this in La Chinoise, to a lesser extent, Pierre Le Fou. I think those are both playing in the next couple of weeks here. But I think the best example of this is his 1966 critique of youth culture, Masculin Féminin, because it's about young people and it's an age where like aesthetics of politics are probably the most important part to one's identity, as my 16-year-old self can tell you. So you have Paul, played by Jean-Pierre Léaud, and he's this young political idealist who spends like 2 minutes of the movie protesting the war and then the rest of it trying to impress this pop star named Madeline, played by Chantal Goya, she with the haircut. So they don't seem to have much in common, but he's attracted to her. So they eventually get together, but she's trying to become a pop star and they don't really align with, her values don't really align with his anti-consumerist ones. So basically the movie is, in a nutshell, is he's pursuing her because he thinks she's hot and then dumps her because he thinks she's shallow, which is both really frustrating and really real to watch. The way that these kind of dynamics play out in youth culture and political movements. It's Godard himself said in Le Petit Soldat that cinema is truth 24 times a second. So I get that there. So back to my poser theory. Godard's characters of both genders can be described as posers. And by that I mean, they're trying to aspire to something outside of their own life beyond really understanding what it is that they're trying to be. Godard made genre films. You have Alphaville, which is a sci-fi dystopia, made in the USA, which is like a gumshoe detective movie. But he also made characters that really want to be in genre films. So yeah, this is often explored through his male characters, probably most famously Belmondo in Breathless, who would imitate Humphrey Bogart's gestures. But this applied to the woman too. So Nana, the character played by Anna Karina in Vive sa vie, she's a failed actress turned prostitute, and she'll tell anyone who listens to her that she was in a movie once with Eddie Constantine, who's a genre actor, an American-born genre actor that Karina herself would later go to star in Alphaville, which was directed by Godard. So A Woman is a Woman is kind of an anomaly in his new wave repertoire, not just because it's a comedy, because I think all his films have this sense of humor about them in this kind of funny, self-conscious way. But again, no one dies. No one blows themselves up or shoots themselves or shoots each other or jumps out of a window or crashes. These movies are really violent in a way that you don't always, I always forget when I was rewatching them all. I was like, a lot of people die. But like his later Korean collaborations, Vive sa vie and Made in the USA, it is a movie that centers a female protagonist. Angela works as a striptease dancer in a nightclub who thinks of her life as an American musical. So Angela, in the movie, she wants a baby. Her partner, Emil, says they can try once they're married. They're living together, but unwed, just as Godard and Karina were at the time, filming off-screen. So Angela is flighty and whimsical and seemingly unserious, which is a departure from her other notable Godard roles, and also from Karina's real-life persona, allegedly. During her marriage with Godard, she would try to attempt suicide no fewer than at least twice. And in the movie, Angela is manipulative. When she realizes she isn't going to have a baby with Emil, she turns to his best friend, Alfred, played again by Jean-Paul Belmondo. Godard had a lot of complicated lady issues, which he tries to work through in his movies. So A Woman is a Woman. It was 4 times more expensive to make than Breathless because, well, one, it was his first movie in color, so that meant a number of things. First, just the film and the processing of the film was more expensive, but also in order to use that film, they needed more elaborate lighting, which included a more elaborate crew of gaffers and grips and makeup artists. It also uses direct sound, which means that the sound that they film is the sound on the movie, whereas Breathless, he would shoot it and then dub it all after, which meant that he could shout out lines to his actors while they were filming and then have them repeat them and then just put all the sound in after. But he couldn't do that with this movie. So this led to a really frustrating shoot where allegedly Godard and Karina would like yell at each other on script. And there's one scene you should look for where Angela is crying while struggling to get her words out. And that was because Karina was trying to keep up with Godard's script, which he would write the morning of and then have his actors memorize, just making it up as he went along. So there aren't any political revolutions in this movie. There's no wars except for the ones that go unacknowledged. It's a very domestic film, but it is kind of a tragedy despite its farcical tone. So the whole movie is a poser. It has the beats and the energy of an American musical comedy without actually being an American musical comedy. There are laughs, but it comes from this warped story where a woman feels trapped by the life she's living, and she believes the only way out is to coerce her boyfriend into this life-changing decision. She doesn't have like the same obvious sad vulnerability that Nana does in Vive sa vie, but you kind of have to like wonder what's going on in her inner life that she needs to go to such lengths to start a family like right then and there. So the film ends on an optimistic note with Angela getting what she wants. But like, what does that mean for the future with Emil? Because in real life, so once they've stopped filming, Karina got pregnant and she and Godard eloped. She had to wear a like loose-fitting dress to hide her pregnancy. And he was a shitty husband. He would disappear for days and weeks at a time. He would tell her he was going out for a pack of cigarettes and be gone for 3 weeks. And she was completely alone when she miscarried at 7 months pregnant. And when he came back, she had this dead baby. Like her life was at risk and he barely noticed. And I mean, Angela is not Anna Karina. It's disingenuous to just assume that to read so much biography into a work of fiction, even if there are these obvious parallels. The movie, it culminates in a pun, which doesn't really translate well, so I'll go over it here. Emile tells Angela that she is infemme, so that literally translates to vile, but in the subtitles, they say it as a without shame, which is a lot softer. And then Angela contradicts him and says, no, I am infemme, a woman, which the subtitles change to a dame. So they have that rhyme in there, but the rhythm is off. And that's also the title of the movie. And then she turns to the camera and breaks the fourth wall one last time. So she is like Angela on screen. She's a equal collaboration between Godard and Karina, and she doesn't exist, but she feels like a very real woman. Thank you. Enjoy the movie.